How good is today, church? I am loving it. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Greatest Showman. Yeah, let's get a show of hands. Who's seen The Greatest Showman? Yep, a few of you. Our family saw it for the first time over Christmas, and I stress the first time because except for Richard, and he'll want me to say this, who is clearly a motorcycle guy, not a musical guy, except for Richard, it has become quite an obsession for the rest of the people living in our home. The themes of this movie are centered around what people think of themselves. Most of the characters in this movie reveal either an over-inflated or an extremely deflated ego. And the movie takes you on a journey to see people overcome hardship and discover what really matters in life. Near the end of the movie, Philip Carlyle, one of the main actors, says this: "When I first met you, I had an inheritance, a claim, an invitation to every party in town, and now thanks to you, all that's gone. All that's left is friendship, love, and a work I adore. You brought joy into my life." That's what God wants for us. He wants us to stop living in the shadows of our egos and to live the life that He planned, a life full of friendship and joy and love and purpose. And we can choose to live in the greatest shadow, or we can choose to step out of that and actually live the greatest show ever made. This year we've been teaching through our discipleship journey. And I just want to take a minute to honour Moala, our beautiful Moala who was singing up the front here today. She painted this week. How amazing is that? Thank you, Moala. When I saw it finished, I honestly thought it looked like it had been printed. You are incredible. Thank you, Moala. That took a long time. This model, this graphic is all about what we believe discipleship looks like, or simply put, what our relationship with Jesus looks like. In our first series this year, Reframed, we looked at the framing of our journey, this big yellow frame, and we learnt that we are all wrapped up in God's love. Whether we realize it or not, if we've woken to that reality or not, it doesn't matter, because whether we like it or not, we are all surrounded by His love. And when we know that, when we figure that out, it changes how we live and love and breathe. And then in our second series, I'm Like You, because we sat in this second triangle over here. We like to call that triangle open mess. And in that space, in that beautiful, broken, messed up reality we live in, the space where we've met Jesus and we're choosing to learn to be family for one another. We are choosing to love one another. Often we call it church, but I think open mess suits it a whole lot better. In that series, we looked at what makes us similar, or as Mariah would put it, what makes us same, instead of what makes us different. We looked at the armor that we put on. We talked about the words that we choose to use and how they set us up to win or how they tear us apart. We spoke about the fact that we are all human and we all face the same end. And today we start the series, The Greatest Shadow. The Greatest Shadow looks at this X that goes right through the middle of our picture. This X is at the beginning, it's at the end. There's actually never a part of our journey with God where this X doesn't play a part. So it's really important that we take a look at it and we think about how it impacts our journey with God and with each other. We started today with the song Come Alive from The Greatest Showman. And I want to read you the words that start that song. You stumble through your days, got your head hung low, your sky's a shade of grey. Like a zombie in a maze, you're asleep inside, but you can shake awake. Because you're just a dead man walking, thinking that's your only option, but you can flip the switch and brighten up your darkest day. Sun is up, the colours blinding. Take the world and redefine it. Leave behind your narrow mind. You'll never be the same. No more living in those shadows. Come alive. When I read those lyrics, I couldn't believe how much they fit with our discipleship model. The description of what it feels like to be unawake, to be dead, hopeless, dark, narrow. But we can shake awake. We can flip the switch. We can take the world and redefine it. And when we do, we'll never be the same. Flipping the switch, turning this X upside down is what our series is all about. When we decide to switch from being full of ourselves to full of Him, when we flip that switch, we go from living in the shadows to living the greatest show, the greatest life ever designed. So where do we start? Well, I think the best place to start is always to see what the Bible has to say. So we're going to have a look at 1 Corinthians. The Corinthian church was full of division. The church was originally planted by Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, but other leaders had since arrived. And as a result, some preferred Paul and others preferred Apollos. And instead of being happy and working together, they are using these relationships to position themselves as leaders. And the divisions that they're creating are beginning to tear the church apart. I want to read to you from 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and from verse 21. It says this: "Don't be proud of your allegiance to any human leader. You already have everything. It's all being given for your benefit, whether it's Paul or Apollos or Peter, whether it's the world or life or death, whether it's the present or the future. Everything belongs to you. Now you are joined to Jesus, who is joined to God. Don't see Apollos and me as leaders of groups, but servants of Jesus. The most important quality of one trusted by God is that they are faithful and trustworthy. Personally, I'm not the least bit concerned if I'm judged by you. I'm not concerned by any verdict I receive from any human court. In fact, I don't even trust my own judgment on this point. Even though my conscience is clear, that doesn't mean I'm right. Only God can examine me and decide. He's the only judge I care about. So don't make judgments about anyone ahead of time. When God returns, He'll reveal our darkest secrets and private motives. Then, when the whole truth is known, each will receive praise from God. It's pointless to move beyond what's written in the Bible and be inflated with self-importance by following and promoting one leader in competition with another. What makes a distinction between you and someone else? What do you have that grace hasn't given you? And if you received it as a gift, why do you boast as though there's something special about you? In this passage, Paul highlights the problems that the Corinthians have as pride and boasting. When we eliminate pride and boasting, we are left with humility. And when we talk about humility, it really leads to a discussion around self-esteem or ego. It's interesting that up until the 20th century, it was traditionally thought that all of the evil in the world, all of the crime, abuse, cruelty was a result of people having too high a view of themselves. Now, in our current Western culture, we've developed the absolute opposite idea, and that is seen through our prison system, it's seen in the way that we counsel people, it's seen in our legislations and in the way that we school our children. Our belief now is that people misbehave out of a lack of self-esteem because they have too low a view of themselves. And when I discovered this, I thought about our school system. I thought of the various ways that it's changed over the years. When I spoke the other week about words that matter, more than a few of you from our more experienced generation, came and shared memories with me about words spoken over your life from a teacher. Words so blunt that they made my skin crawl. Words like, nothing good will ever come of your life. Statements like, you will never amount to anything. I like to think that statements like these this day, in this day and age, would get a person fired. I think about the way that school reports have changed over a relatively short period of time. When I was a child, my report card would more often than not read, hey mum, Karyn talks too much in class. That comment didn't take a lot of interpretation, there was no guesswork necessary for my parents. But only a short while later, obviously only a short while later, for my children, it would instead read, Ella is a natural communicator. It's like, really? I talked to Karyn Seifaloy, who works at the school here next door, and she helped me with a few more examples. These days, a report would read, Harry is very friendly and with encouragement completes learning tasks. In my day, it would have been, Harry is always distracted and rarely finishes anything. These days, it would say, Harry is an active student who is learning to follow instructions explicitly. In my day, it would be, Harry can't sit still, he is always in time out. And my last one, these days, Harry is learning to respect and care for the property of others. In my day, it would have been, Harry steals lunches and pencils. I want you to have a look at this cartoon. Can you read what it says? It says, explain, what is it? Explain these bad grades. So in 1969, it was all the child's fault. What is it today? Yeah, have I got any teachers in the room want to say amen to that? What this passage in Corinthians does is give us an approach to ego and the way that we see ourselves that is actually totally different to the one given by both the traditional and the modern or contemporary cultures. And the three things that Paul shows us in this passage are, number one, the condition of the natural human ego. Number two, a transformed sense of self brought about through the gospel. And number three, how to get that transformed sense of self. And so over our 3-week series, we're going to take a look at each of these. But today, I'm just going to take a look at the first one, the natural condition of the human ego. Paul asks the Corinthians to no longer have pride in one person over another. And to do this, he uses the Greek word phusio, and that relates to the ego. It means over-inflated. It means swollen, extended beyond its normal size. Paul says that that is the state of the natural human ego. This series is based on the book, The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness, written by Timothy Keller. And in his book, he talks about this image of the ego being overinflated and swollen beyond its normal size. And from that image, he suggests that there are 4 things that are true of our natural ego. Firstly, he says that our ego can be empty, it can be painful, it can be busy, and it can be fragile. So we're going to take a look at each of these things this morning to help us identify, maybe even diagnose the condition of our ego. So I want you to just sit back, think of yourself as being in the doctor's office, and let's diagnose where we're at. The first suggestion is that there is emptiness at the core of the human ego. So if we're over here and we're full of ego, often it can feel empty. An ego that is puffed up and swollen is obviously empty at its core. It's Soren Kierkegaard says it's the normal state of the human heart to try to build identity around something other than God. Spiritual pride is the illusion that we are able to run our own lives, achieve our own sense of self-worth, and find purpose big enough to give us meaning in life without God. He says the normal human ego is built on something other than God. It searches for something that will bring it worth, that will bring it a sense of purpose. But as we know, if we try to put something in the space that was only meant for God, then it will always be too small, and the space will always feel empty. The second thing that an extended or over-inflated ego will feel, I'm really vertically challenged, I need someone tall, is painful. Have you ever thought about the fact that we don't think of or notice certain parts of our body until something is wrong with it? You know, when we walk around, we don't think about how fantastic our toes are feeling today. What an amazing job our toes are doing at balancing us today. We don't sit at the computer and think, oh man, my elbows today, my elbows are on point. They are just working awesome today. We generally only think about them if there is something wrong with them. And when I thought about that, I was reminded of the weekend of the 30th anniversary here at Papster a month ago. Things were all go that weekend. It was Sabbath afternoon, and our family had taken home the runners' bibs for the Trailbuster event that was happening the next day. And our family sat around the coffee table, and we had to put 4 safety pins on each bib. And we'd finally finished that job, and we had the dinner that night. And I put the 150 bibs on the bottom step by our front door so that I wouldn't forget them after I'd put them into alphabetical order. I was so very proud of them. And then I ran upstairs to grab something. And as I got halfway up the stairs, I remembered that I'd forgotten to take something up with me. So I swung around on the first landing to go back downstairs, but I forgot that I was still wearing stockings that I'd worn to church. And so as I swiveled, my feet went from underneath me. But I had so much momentum going because I was running that I flew down the entire flight of stairs, collecting the bibs on the bottom step as I went, which all went flying into the air. The damage, other than that to my ego, funnily enough, was just bruising. But that bruising went down the back of my arms, it went all down my back, it was on my butt, my thighs, and my hips. It wouldn't have been so bad, but 24 hours later, I was about to begin a 25-hour journey where all of my weight would be sitting on those bruises. So I get this. I never think about any of those parts of my body. But for those couple of days, I was acutely aware of them. Often our ego hurts because there's something wrong with it. Our ego is always drawing attention to itself. It does so every single day. It draws attention to the way we look and how we're treated. We often say that our feelings have been hurt, but our feelings can't feel pain. It's our ego that hurts. Just like walking around doesn't hurt my toes unless there's something wrong with them, my ego wouldn't hurt unless there's something wrong with it. It's often hard to get through a day without feeling hurt or offended or snubbed by somebody. And that's because there's something wrong with our ego, our identity, our sense of self, because it's always drawing attention to itself. So the third thing, firstly, our ego can be empty, it can be painful. The third thing it can be is, how high can I go? Busy. When I say busy, like I said, our ego is always drawing attention to itself and it's always trying to fill the emptiness. And it does that largely by comparing and boasting. Paul talks about this in the passage that we read. way the normal ego tries to ease its discomfort and fill its emptiness is by comparing itself to other people. And it does it all of the time. In his book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis says that pride, by its very nature, is competitive. He says pride gets no pleasure from having something, only from having more than someone. Did you get that? Pride gets no pleasure from having something, only from having more than someone. We tend to think that people are proud of being rich or clever or talented or good looking, but they're not. They're only proud of being more clever, more talented, better looking, more talented than somebody else. And the trouble is with that, is that when we're in the presence of somebody who is more successful, more intelligent, more good looking than us, then we lose all pleasure in what we had. Because pride is only the pleasure of having more than the next person. In fact, pride is the pleasure of being more than the next person. Brené Brown says it this way: ego says you have no inherent worth. How fast you're going to run, how high you're going to jump, how many likes do you have on Facebook, how many comments on your post. We live in a culture that measures worth on how many likes we get on Facebook. We live in a scarcity culture. Never enough. Never good enough, safe enough, rich enough, thin enough, certain enough. I'm not liked enough. I don't have enough. I am not enough. Our ego is so very, very busy. The fourth thing that our ego feels is fragile. I need my balloon. Thanks. Thanks, Will. Okay. So, fragile because anything that is over-inflated is in danger of being deflated. If we are puffed up by air and not filled with something solid, then to be over-inflated or deflated basically comes down to the same thing. A superiority complex or an inferiority complex are basically the same. They're both the result of being over-inflated. Because a person with a superiority complex is over-inflated and in danger of being deflated. And the person with an inferiority complex is deflated already, but an ego only becomes deflated because at some point it was over-inflated. Deflated or in imminent danger of being deflated, it has the same result, and it makes the ego fragile. Thanks, Will. Empty, painful, busy, and therefore fragile. Anytime we accomplish something, these are the thoughts that we can have. Now that I've achieved something, I've become somebody. But the next day I realize that unless I keep going, unless I keep achieving, then I'm not again. My ego can't be satisfied. My sense of self, my desire for worth, my need to be somebody isn't fulfilled because my ego is like a black hole. It doesn't matter how much I feed it, the next day it's empty and needs refilling. That's the natural state of the human ego. It was George Bernard Shaw who said, "This is the true joy of life. Being used for a purpose seen by yourself as a mighty one, being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clot of ailments and grievances, complaining the world will not devote itself to making you happy." Wow. Tell it straight, George Bernard Shaw. It's not really been very good news so far, has it? That's because today we've been diagnosing. But over the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about the medicine. We're going to talk about the cure. So the good news is coming, I promise you. We can flip the switch. We can turn this X upside down. And we're going to look at ways to do that over the next 2 weeks. So I want to encourage you to be here for the next 2 weeks as we explore how to do this better, how to do this well. Because when we do, our thinking gets turned upside down, and then our life gets turned upside down, just like the X does. When I wrote this, and I thought about what a life looks like when it's flipped upside down, when people choose to think less of themselves and more on God, I couldn't help but think of Martin Luther King Jr. I got the opportunity recently to visit the museum in Atlanta that tells his story. At the end of the journey through his life, they play a video, and it's a video of part of his funeral, and they're actually his recorded words from the last sermon that he ever preached. And these are the words that he spoke. He said, "If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. If you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 to 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to say that I tried to feed the hungry, that I tried to clothe the naked. I want you to say that I tried in my life to visit those who were in prison, and I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. I want you to say I was a drum major for justice, a drum major for peace, a drum major for righteousness, and all the other shallow things won't matter. I won't have money to leave, but I want to leave a committed life. And that's all I want to say. If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a song, if I can show somebody he's been traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain." What a way to end a life. What a way to live a life. With purpose, passion, devotion, direction, and commitment. Commitment to doing what God wants to do in and through us. When we live that life, when we live a life filled with God instead of us, we come alive. We go and light our light so it burns so bright it reaches up to the sky and it's open wide. We're electrified. And we know we can't go back again to the world that we were living in because we're dreaming with our eyes wide open. Perhaps to today, let's commit to flipping the switch. Let's learn how to do that over the next 2 weeks, and let's choose to live a life full of purpose, passion, devotion, and direction to do what God calls us to do. Would you pray with me? God, today we choose to no longer live in the shadows our egos create. We don't want to live in that shade, in that darkness. We want to come alive in you, God. We want to think less of ourselves and what we want and so much more on you and what you want for us and for everyone around us. God, help us to see through this series that we are who you say we are. We are a child of yours, and we will no longer let our ego, we will no longer let the devil tell us any different. God, today we choose to not go back to the world that we've been living in. We choose to open our eyes wide to you today. And God, today we choose to flip the switch, to turn our ego upside down. Today, God, we choose to come alive.